Europe is sliding into one of its most precarious geopolitical dilemmas in recent memory, caught in a storm of economic retaliation and strategic miscalculations. The latest signal came from Beijing, sanctions imposed on 2 European banks. Not large institutions, not global players, but a symbolic strike with far-reaching implications. On the surface, it might appear insignificant, yet beneath lies a stark message. China is willing to retaliate, and next time, it could be against far bigger targets. But the irony is hard to miss. This confrontation didn't begin in Asia, it started in Brussels. It was the European Union that fired the first shot by sanctioning 2 small Chinese banks for alleged cooperation with Russia. The move was part of a broader sanctions package tied to the war in Ukraine, but it was also shaped by pressure from across the Atlantic. In Washington, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had been lobbying Europe to take a tougher stance, not just against Russia, but against the broader BRICS alliance. Not for Europe's sake, but to protect the central role of the U.S. dollar in global trade. And so Brussels followed suit. The consequences, however, may prove disastrous. Europe's economic interdependence with the BRICS bloc is massive, amounting to hundreds of billions of euros. Italy, for example, demonstrates just how deep that entanglement runs. Take the tire manufacturer Pirelli, a key Italian brand with a major stake owned by a Chinese state-backed firm. That partnership was supposed to offer Pirelli access to China's massive auto market. But under the Trump administration, Pirelli tires were blocked from Formula One sales in the United States, justified by vague claims of national security. And now, Trump is preparing to escalate further, this time targeting the semiconductor industry with sweeping new trade measures. If implemented, this could ignite a cascade of disruptions. Soaring prices, dismantled supply chains, and a continent-wide economic backlash that Europe is woefully unprepared to handle. This all feeds into a larger strategic shift, marked by a threat Trump issued just weeks ago. Standing before cameras, he warned BRICS nations that any move to create an alternative global currency, anything that might rival the dollar, would be met with across-the-board tariffs. Not targeted sanctions, not select categories. A universal 10% tariff on all goods, without exception. The message couldn't have been clearer. The dollar must remain supreme, and any challenge would be crushed economically. Europe, instead of recalibrating for its own strategic interests, chose loyalty over logic, rushing to align with Washington. In early August, the EU unveiled its 18th sanctions package since the invasion of Ukraine began. Hidden within that document was a seemingly trivial detail. Sanctions against 2 rural Chinese banks, Swifenhe Rural Commercial Bank and Hihei Rural Commercial Bank. These are not financial powerhouses. They conduct local cross-border transactions, regional financing, and some niche cryptocurrency activity. Crucially, they don't operate in Europe. No offices, no European clients, no access to the EU's financial system. In practical terms, the sanctions accomplished nothing. But to Beijing, they represented a provocation. China had warned Europe. Foreign Minister Wang Yi made it explicit in closed-door meetings. Sanctions on Chinese financial institutions would not go unanswered. Brussels ignored the warning, and the response came swiftly. On August 13th, China imposed sanctions on 2 Lithuanian banks, UAB Urbankas and AB Monobankas. These aren't major players either. They operate mostly within Lithuania's domestic financial ecosystem. But their selection wasn't random. It was a message carefully crafted for maximum symbolic weight. China's diplomatic spat with Lithuania dates back to 2021, when Vilnius allowed Taiwan to open a representative office under its own name, a move that enraged Beijing. China downgraded diplomatic ties, expelled Lithuanian diplomats, and halted Lithuanian imports. So when Europe struck at China's banks, Beijing knew exactly where to hit back. The sanctions now prevent Chinese companies and individuals from doing business with the 2 Lithuanian banks, sending a crystal-clear signal. It's not about size, it's about precedent. Any act of escalation, no matter how small, will trigger a response. This tit-for-tat might seem limited now, but for Europe, it's a glimpse into a much larger vulnerability. Because in this brewing confrontation, it is Europe, not China, that has more to lose. Trade between the EU and China reached nearly $800 billion in 2024. China is one of the most important markets for European exports. German automotive giants like Volkswagen and BMW sell more cars in China than at home. French luxury brands like LVMH rely on Chinese demand for champagne, handbags, and high fashion. Italy provides industrial equipment, Spain ships agricultural goods, and all across the continent, businesses depend on stable access to Chinese consumers. The dependence goes both ways. Europe imports from China critical components for its future. Solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, rare earth elements, and pharmaceuticals. These are the backbone of the EU's green transition, its push toward renewable energy, electric mobility, and industrial decarbonization. Disruptions in these imports could bring those ambitions to a standstill. And all of that is now being put at risk, not by Chinese aggression, but by Europe's decision to follow Washington's lead. Brussels appears trapped in a cycle of deference. Even as Trump openly threatens European industries, promising new tariffs on steel, cars, and other goods, and accusing the EU of exploiting America in trade, Europe continues to align itself with US priorities. The result is strategic incoherence, targeting China to curry favor with a US administration that simultaneously prepares trade war measures against Europe itself. This is the real danger. The BRICS bloc has grown beyond its original 5 members, now including over 20 countries, among them Brazil, India, and South Africa, economies that represent a substantial portion of the global South. By antagonizing this group, Europe risks alienating vital partners, while gaining little in return. It is a policy driven not by necessity, but by pressure, an approach that puts the EU on a collision course with its own economic survival. In the end, this is not just about sanctions or banking regulations. It is about Europe's role in a rapidly shifting global order, and whether it will navigate that change with strategic independence, or continue to act as a secondary player in someone else's game. Europe now finds itself urgently searching for new economic partners, precisely the kind it is simultaneously pushing away. In the wake of the war in Ukraine, sanctions were expected to cripple Moscow. But Russia hasn't collapsed. Instead, it has adapted, creating alternative payment systems, redirecting oil and gas exports to India and China, and increasingly using local currencies instead of the dollar. It's even begun experimenting with the digital yuan. Meanwhile, targeted sanctions on a pair of minor border banks have achieved little. Symbolically, the EU aligned itself with Washington's pressure campaign, eager to show unity and strength. But in doing so, it triggered unintended consequences, chief among them provoking China, a strategic partner Europe cannot afford to lose, and got nothing substantial in return. To truly understand the stakes, one must zoom out to see the broader geopolitical shift underway. At its core, this isn't just about sanctions, tariffs, or regional conflicts. This is a global battle over the future of economic power and the financial system that underpins it. The United States is fighting to preserve the dominance of the dollar, still the world's primary reserve currency. But that supremacy is no longer unchallenged. The BRICS nations, led by China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, are not just growing, they're building alternatives to the dollar-based financial order. They're creating independent payment systems, expanding trade in national currencies, and forging deeper economic integration. This is what lies behind Washington's growing sense of urgency. It's also what fueled Trump's aggressive tariff campaigns. On the surface, his threats appeared to be about trade deficits and manufacturing jobs. In reality, they were about defending the dollar's privileged role at the center of the global economy. But each new threat and each new tariff only serves to unite BRICS nations further. Rather than deterring them, Washington's pressure is accelerating their cooperation. The bloc is expanding, welcoming new members, and focusing intensely on decoupling from the US-led system. At their latest summit, cross-border trade in local currencies was a major focus, and momentum is clearly building. Europe, caught in the middle of this realignment, has misplayed its hand. Instead of pursuing a balanced foreign policy that safeguards its own economic interests, Brussels has chosen to bind itself tightly to Washington's agenda. In doing so, it exposes itself to blowback, not only from China's likely retaliatory measures, but from the broader global transition away from the dollar. Europe had a unique opportunity to act as a diplomatic and economic bridge between competing global powers, but that role is slipping away. Instead, the EU is clinging to a partner whose leverage is waning, while the rest of the world adapts to a new financial reality. Italy provides a clear case study of how US pressure is shaping European policy decisions, not through logic or economic necessity, but through fear. At first glance, Rome's decision to scale back economic ties with China might appear strategic, but the motivation wasn't national interest. It was concern over how Washington would react. Chinese investment had been a lifeline for many Italian industries, delivering capital, technology, and access to one of the world's largest consumer markets. And yet, instead of fostering this relationship, Italy is now being urged to dismantle it. Take Pirelli, an iconic name in Italian manufacturing. The Chinese state company Sinochem holds a 37% stake, which should, in theory, open doors to the vast Chinese automotive market and unlock new growth. But the US stepped in, branding Pirelli's tires a national security threat and blocking their use in Formula One racing in America. The message was clear. Even tires can be politicized. The implications are chilling. Washington is deciding which European firms can expand and which must be restrained, based not on merit, but on geopolitical calculations. And Europe is paying the price. Since 2022, German exports to China, especially in sectors like automobiles and precision engineering, have sharply declined. With Russian energy off the table, European industries are now forced to rely on more expensive alternatives. Manufacturers across the EU are paying 2 to 3 times more for energy than their Asian competitors. That cost gap is crippling. It's eroding competitiveness, triggering production cuts, offshoring, and widespread job losses. And just as Europe grapples with this economic strain, Washington is preparing a move that could destabilize the entire global economy. A new wave of tariffs targeting semiconductors. According to leaks from the US administration, Trump is considering tariffs of up to 300% on foreign-made microchips. The goal? To pressure tech giants like Taiwan's TSMC, South Korea's Samsung, and Japan's Tokyo Electron to shift their supply chains to the United States. But this strategy is fraught with risk. If these companies comply, production costs in America, where labor and infrastructure are far more expensive, will skyrocket. Those costs will ripple through every sector, raising prices on everything from smartphones and laptops to electric vehicles and defense equipment. If they refuse, American consumers will bear the burden, as chip shortages and higher prices cascade across the economy. And that's not all. The global supply of rare earth elements, already under pressure, will become even more strained, threatening long-term technological stability. This isn't careful industrial policy. It's an attempt to dominate the global semiconductor market through brute force. But the gamble is a dangerous one. Can the US really coerce Asian producers into submission without triggering massive retaliation? Retaliation that could ultimately backfire on its own tech sector? And what will happen to Europe if this escalation goes forward? The consequences will not stop at America's borders. A collapse of global trade structures, built over decades, would hit both the US and EU hard. For Europe, already squeezed between Chinese countermeasures and Washington's growing demands, this would mean being dragged deeper into a conflict it cannot shape and cannot win. It faces a storm it doesn't control, but that will shape its future. And so, the defining question emerges. Will Europe find the courage to chart its own course? To defend its economic sovereignty? To protect its industries? To strike a balance between competing powers? Or will it continue sacrificing its long-term interests at the altar of transatlantic loyalty? That decision will determine whether Europe fades into economic irrelevance, or finds its place in a world that is rapidly learning to live without the dollar.